Hi, everyone. I'm Whitney Webb, and an independent investigative journalist and editor of Unlimited Hangout at unlimitedhangout.com. Welcome to a panel called Interrogating Cold War 2.0, brought to you by Unlimited Hangout and Off Guardian. Today's panel will focus on the growing East-West divide, its implications for the economic future of the world, its impact on globalism, and how it relates to the ongoing dramatic socioeconomic policy shifts that are often collectively referred to as the Great Reset. In addition, we will be exploring the role of the West in the current rise of China and Russia, whether Russia and China are exercising a more moral foreign policy than their counterparts in NATO, and whether we should pick a side of this dichotomy. And without further ado, here are our panelists for today. We have Patrick Wood. Patrick is a financial analyst, writer, and speaker, as well as the author of Technocracy Rising, the Trojan Horse of Global Transformation. And he's also co-author of Trilaterals over Washington with Anthony Sutton about the Trilateral Commission. He is also the editor-in-chief of the website technocracy.news. Next, we have Iain Davis. Iain is an independent investigative journalist, blogger, and author from Portsmouth in the United Kingdom. He is a contributor to UK Column and also Unlimited Hangout. His work is often featured by Off Guardian, The Corbett Report, and Zero Hedge, among others. He also has his own website, In This Together, which you can find at in-this-together.com. We have Kit Knightley. Kit is a UK-based independent journalist, and he is editor of Off Guardian, which you can find at off-guardian.org. And last but not least, we have Catherine Austin Fitz. Catherine is the president of Solari Inc., which publishes the Solari Report at solari.com. And she is also a managing member of Solari Investment Advisory Services. Prior to Solari, she held top positions at the Wall Street Investment Bank, Dillon Read & Co., and was also Assistant Secretary of Housing and the Federal Housing Commissioner for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So welcome, everyone. Nice to have you here.
Good to be here.
Hi.
Always fun.
All right, so let's start with a question on the East-West divide. What do you all see as the nature of the East-West divide? Is it ideological, political, a mix of the two, or merely superficial? Why don't we start with you, Catherine, since you are next to me on the fifth.
So from an investment position, if you look at the world from a central investment position, it looks to me the people who have been financing the West are the same as are financing the East. At the same time, there are tremendous struggles, one of which is that at the end of the end of the Cold War, the G7 nations wanted to exercise essentially a unipolar model and extend the unipolar model globally, whereas the economies that were growing fast, thanks to Western investment, wanted to maintain national sovereignty outside of control through essentially increasingly the financial system and financial sanctions. So I think on one hand, at the very top, you have, you have a central investment model that's financing both sides. At the same time, you have real significant differences both in the economic model and whether or not national sovereignty will be permitted. The G7 nations clearly want a world without national sovereignty, and the so-called BRIC nations want significantly more national sovereignty, and the way they want to run that national sovereignty is more with government entities than with banks and corporations. So there are very significant differences as well.
All right, anyone else want to add to that, or any takers? Iain? Any thoughts on the question or what Catherine said about the nature of the East-West divide?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very much depends upon from whose perspective you're considering that East-West divide. I think there are some people probably within for example, the military infrastructures on both sides of that equation that do see a very real confrontation or a very real divide. But then, as Catherine was saying, if we look at it from a global financing perspective, that divide's less obvious. And then, and I think also it's true to say that if we talk about the people, there's definitely a different mindset on either side of that divide. But if we look at it politically, I think that divide becomes less clear. I think that there is. I agree with Catherine that there's this idea of a unipolar model versus a multipolar model, for want of a better expression. But for my perspective, I don't see a great distinction between the two. I think national sovereignty is a mechanism by which governments, certainly if you're looking at Russia and China, is a way of kind of introducing their population to a new kind of governance, which I believe is technocracy, in both Russia and China. And I think, we might go on to discuss why. And I think that they are using that for reasons of firstly kind of asserting their dominant role over a global structure. And I think we are going to be looking at a global structure. But also I think we need to remember as well that it is useful sometimes to have what appear to be opposing forces. That game has been played for a long time. We often talk about divide and rule, and there's a reason for that. It works in a general sense. So if you want to control your populations, having a different approach to what is essentially the same way of controlling your population, I think that there's that as well.
Oh, Patrick, you're muted.
Yeah, I'll say that your thought about control is absolutely right. The original technocracy group in the 1930s led with the idea that technocracy is the science of social engineering. That was part and parcel of their philosophy, their ideology. And economic control required social control. And we see that everywhere that we have this technocratic meme impressed. We see that coming out. Social control yields or is lord over economic control. China is really big on this. Europe's really big on this. The United States is getting worse and worse every day with social control, propaganda, and so on being used as tools. And this kind of since it's a global in nature at this point, it's kind of a tell that this is really the agenda, not just, well, this country made a mistake, that country has, too many Democrats, left-wingers, whatever, too much wokeness. No, this seems to be, it's a global problem from the top down right now, and it's the same kind of techniques are being used everywhere.
Patrick, can I ask you a question? Because it looks to me like everyone's fully on board for technocracy, but Russia and China prefer their technocracy to have more of their national government as the middle manager for the technocracy, but they also prefer to run more of the technocracy with government than with corporations and banks. So it's absolutely technocracy, but the details of the implementation are somewhat different.
Yeah.
Does it look that way to you?
Well, it does. And I'll say for decades, the people who are pushing technocracy have been content to stay behind the scenes, behind the political front. And we saw this in America starting way back with the Carter administration, all the way going forward to today, that this technocrat types have, like the old World War II movie, Run Silent, Run Deep. They've been there the whole time. They have been executing their strategy the whole time. And they've been, in many cases, they've been using the government to do it. A good example of that, I think, is the takeover of the American government by members of the Trilateral Commission during the Carter administration. You had at one time 30% of the membership of the American side of the Trilateral Commission in top positions, like cabinet positions in Carter's administration. And they said back then, we're not political. We're not interested in political takeover. It sure looked that way. And we made that charge, but we finally started to figure out after 20 years went by what really happened. They weren't interested in the political structure of America at all. What they wanted was control over the economic engine of the world.
Right.
And they got that through appointing presidents of the World Bank, for instance, which 6 out of 9 were members of the Trilateral Commission. 9 out of 12 of the U.S. trade representatives thereafter were members of the Trilateral Commission. And they took over the entire economic structure moving forward of the whole planet. And now they've exercised this. We see their influence everywhere, but they weren't really after they were using the political system, I put it that way, to get what they wanted, which was economic control.
For people watching who may not know, can you just briefly explain what the Trilateral Commission is? Its 2 co-founders. Just a little background, maybe.
Sure. Founded in 1973 by David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski. Rockefeller is the money man, Chase Bank, oil interest, monopoly interest. And then you had Brzezinski, a professor of political science at Columbia University. Brzezinski caught Rockefeller's eye with his book that he wrote at Columbia called Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technotronic Era. And Rockefeller saw that as a way to get increasing control over resources. Because I think from just a pure mathematical point of view, even back then, he saw that there would be an end one day in the future to the existing monetary system. That was back when gold had been just decoupled from the dollar. The world was now completely fiat currency. Rockefeller was not stupid. And from his monetary analysis point of view, there would be a time someday in the future, I think that day's probably come now, where the financial system would be completely kaput. And the only answer to that, in his mind, was to take over resources directly. In other words, not just use the money in the bank to control things, but to get your way, but actually go after control over resources directly. And I think this is what we've seen ever since, honestly. That's what Agenda 21 was all about, Agenda 2030, the United Nations Sustainable Development, et cetera, et cetera. It's been about accumulation and consolidation of resources on a planetary basis.
Okay, Kit, do you have anything you want to add in here, or?
Yeah, I would say, returning back to the original question on the nature of the split. I mean, obviously you can roll out ideological. Theoretically, everyone's a free market capitalist now in one way, to a certain degree or another. I would put it in software terms. You roll out a new program, you have here's our new alpha tested program. And that was, we're all going to be friends. That was tried in COVID, you see. There was an end to geopolitical differences. Even ISIS stopped doing terrorism because of the pandemic was going to make everybody friendly. And then you have that slowly wearing off after 2 years and a return to what in software terms you call a stable build. Everybody understood the Cold War, so we'll just do that again. Only it's somewhat forced this time. I would say the difference between Russia and China saying it's about sovereignty and us talking about open world, open borders stuff, I would say that's largely a superficial difference designed to appeal to a market base. If you're going to sell apples in Rome, you say the Pope loves apples. And if you're going to sell them in Riyadh, you say Allah loves apples. But they're the same apples either way.
All right, so we can move on to another question. What has the West's role in the economies of Russia and China been, what has been the West's role in the economies of Russia and China over the past several decades, and what impact has this had on the rise of Eurasia? Anyone interested in starting?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah, go
you
ahead.
want to go, Pat? You go, Pat.
I want to hear you. I want to hear you first.
Yeah.
So I think the investment has been extraordinary in both China and Russia, although in very different ways. So we saw a transfer both of capital, of intellectual capital, and extraordinary even gifting of technology to China from the mid-90s on. And in many respects, that still continues. So there is a huge bet being made on China. And I would not describe it so much as, in a sense, you can say it's coming from the West. But I think if you look at the people who operate the allocation of capital globally, it's coming from the very top. And it's not stopping. Not that there haven't been changes in evolution. So that's the huge bet on China and Asia. Russia was clearly essentially raped at the end of the Cold War. And I think Russia has come back faster than was expected. But in the process, there was a great effort to take ownership positions and control of investment positions in Russia. And through that, there was some investment, but I would say much less than China. Interestingly enough, the sanctions have afforded enormous investment in Russia and transfer of assets. If you look at the transfer of assets that is happening now as a result of the sanctions, my serious question is this really just a transfer of significant wealth and assets to Russia, as under the pretext of sanctions. Either way, the tension economically, interestingly enough, has been the same tension you've seen domestically in many countries. And that is, we have a global economy where capital is using force to extract returns that it doesn't deserve at the expense of laborers or commodity producers. And so we have throughout the world, and certainly India, China, Russia, the BRIC nations, they're tired of extraction of wealth through financial speculation and financial currency debasement. And at some point, if an economy doesn't return capital to the people who produce the wealth, you're going to get real schisms. And we are watching in the G7 nations the rise of an elite. And you know this better than any, Whitney. We're all waiting for your book that proves it once again. We have a criminal syndicate. We're dealing with Spectre. If you ever watch the James Bond movie, Spectre is extracting too much of the wealth. And frankly, the populations in the G7 nations and around the world are sick of it. And those who still have enough command of military and national resources can do something about it. So I think this is a revolution of the productive against the unproductive. And interestingly enough, the guys who run the global capital in this respect are supporting the productive. It's what it looks like to me.
Yeah.
All right. Do you want to go next, Patrick?
Yeah, I'll just add on. I'll add to that. Anthony Sutton wrote two books, one that underscore this. Of course, his series at Stanford University on the transfer of technology from the West to the East are epic and legendary at this point. You can maybe find them on the internet for $1,000 a volume, but they're very rare. But he nailed it 6 Ways to Sunday back then, what had happened. He ended up writing Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler. He wrote Wall Street and the Rise of Russia, or whatever, I forget exactly the title, but he had nailed this back then. If he were alive today, my guess is he'd probably be writing a book, Wall Street and the Rise of X, whatever the Great Reset is. But this has been legendary, going all the way back to World War I. The West has financed, the Wall Street has financed most of the conflicts in the world. That means that they've been on both sides. And their activities in Russia, even in the USSR, were also legendary. People like Arm & Hammer, for instance, flew back and forth without passports. So did David Rockefeller. And they could go anywhere in Russia, do anything they wanted to do, and they never got any trouble. Anybody else, mere people like us, would probably get arrested and thrown into the gulag. China's been the same way. When China came back onto the world stage, my mind goes back to 1976, when Zbigniew Brzezinski wined and dined Deng Xiaoping in Washington. That was after Henry Kissinger had already gone to China on an illegal trip. Made a lot of people really mad back then, but it was an illegal trip that Nixon sent him on to reestablish relationships with China, which looked a lot like North Korea at the time. It was a train wreck. They had no economic system. They tripped over themselves to spin down in a cesspool. Deng Xiaoping came to Washington and smiled and got wined and dined by Brzezinski. Brzezinski later became widely hailed in the history books as being the architect of bringing China back into the world stage. So my question became, as I studied the Trilateral Commission and Brzezinski, who was a brilliant strategist, evil maybe, but brilliant. When China came onto the world stage, did Brzezinski and crew teach them free market economics and capitalism, or did they teach them the principles of technocracy? I think the evidence now, looking backwards, clearly says they were taught the elements of technocracy, not free market economics. We see that expressed even to the point where Time magazine wrote a major article in I think around 2000 that said point blank, China's a technocracy now, and they gave reasons for it in context to the original technocracy movement back in the 1930s. So by the insiders, this has been recognized that China became a technocracy. But what we found out to confirm that, it was a fact we found out back then, but it meant something more to me later. By the time Brzezinski was talking to Deng Xiaoping in Washington, the largest private engineering company in the world, Bechtel Engineering, which is based in the Bay Area, San Francisco area, was chaired by a guy named Caspar Weinberger. Caspar Weinberger was one of those founding members of the Trilateral Commission. Very influential globally because it was the largest engineering company, private engineering company, maybe one of the largest engineering companies, period, in the world. By the time Deng Xiaoping had come to Washington, Bechtel Engineering had already completed 18 major infrastructure projects in China, all illegal. In other words, it was illegal to do business with China back in that day. But they were private, and so they just, sail their own ship over there with their equipment to go do it. They just went and did it. 18 major infrastructure projects. You say, well, what's that? That means, okay, they're connecting roads, they're building dams, or power plants and stuff like that, to get ready for the economic boom that was going to take place in China. They engineered this from the get-go. Yeah. And the money that flowed into China initially was mostly connected with the Trilateral Commission, group of companies that were represented in the Trilateral Commission, at the expense of other companies in America that would gladly have done business, but they were frozen out because they weren't part of the club. We documented this now. So, you look back at this whole thing and say, well, how did China get to where it is today? Wall Street, people in the Trilateral Commission, those companies, whatever, that went over and did business. They opened up China. China never had the capacity to do any of that stuff. They didn't know how to build a dam. They couldn't build roads or anything else, bridges and stuff that companies like Bechtel probably looked like a bunch of magicians to these people at the time. So I look back at this, I see the same kind of construction taking place in China that took place in communist Russia at one point in time by the West, by Western money. They actually enabled those institutions to stay in business for as long as they did. And even when they died, they were still in control because they were like the run silent, run deep type of a submarine. They said, we still got control. Whatever happens to your political system, we're still in charge of everything. And here we are today, birds of a feather flock together. So you see people in Silicon Valley, they love China. They absolutely love China because there's technocrats in China, there's technocrats in Silicon Valley say, hey, we're brothers, man. We're across the sea, but we're all brothers here. And they can look at a lot of people in Europe and say the same thing. We're all brothers. We can get along. But the political establishment, they look down their nose at it. They say, phooey, we don't care about the political establishment. We're doing the real work here. So nothing is new.
To that effect about Silicon Valley, there was a recent podcast with the former head of Google, Eric Schmidt, basically praising China's approach to all of this. And he's talking with people like H.R. McMaster and some big guys, and he's basically saying we need to know what they're doing because they have AI under control and we don't. Unsurprisingly, perhaps he co-wrote his new book on AI with Henry Kissinger.
Yes.
Yeah. Sounds like a fun way to spend your time reading that book.
Eric Schmidt is a recent member of the Trilateral Commission. He's been a member for several years now. He was inducted into the Trilateral Commission. It still has the same makeup and same goals it had back in the 70s. And now, as it appears, you mentioned his book with Henry Kissinger. Eric Schmidt apparently is the heir apparent to Henry Kissinger.
The New York Times has said that. I've seen that around, yeah.
Yes, Kissinger continues to affirm Eric Schmidt as kind of being the intellectual thought leader now for what's coming. And it's like, oh my gosh. So you see these people's influence continuing today with things like Eric Schmidt. Eric Schmidt's one of the most dangerous people on the planet as far as I'm concerned.
So I would not disagree with that.
I have to tell you, Patrick, we did something new this quarter. we were getting so many stories of unbelievably bizarre events that we created a section called Bizarro World so that those stories would not detract from you understanding the things you needed to know going through the, sort of the major areas of importance. So now that you've told me that, I'm going to find a story about that. I'm going to put it in Bizarro World, because the idea of Eric Schmidt being the next Henry Kissinger really speaks to how bizarre this is.
I agree. You can't make us up.
Right. You couldn't. If you brought me this as a script, I would say this won't play in New Haven.
Iain, Kit, anything to add
I don't want to get into this pattern of listening intently to some very in-depth historical analysis and just summing it up with something glib, but I'm afraid that's what's about to happen.
Go for it, Kit. Go.
Basically, I suppose the original question is slightly flawed. You say, how much role did the West play in the rise of the East? But really, it would better phrase is, how much of a role did people who temporarily call the West home play in the rise of the East? Wall Street money. These aren't people that actually have a national loyalty.
Yeah.
And I suppose the extension of the question in the end is, at what point do they simply up sticks and move and leave America to fester? Because I think that will happen at some point.
Right.
Iain, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree with what's been said very much so far. I mean, I liken it to, a scorpion on the back of a frog. So, the idea that, the frog's dead, the Western frog is dead or is drowning, and for a long time they've been talking about creating a new frog. So it's, if I looked at it as through foreign direct investment, the foreign direct investment that went from the West to China in particular, because obviously that comes with other things attached, including an exchange of employees, technological transfers and everything like that. And the foreign direct investment growth from the sort of early 90s to the late 90s and to now, or up to the pandemic. I mean, that's another interesting thing. I mean, while the world shut down in response to what I call the pseudo pandemic, FDI went up in China in 2020. It went up by 4%. I mean, it's if that doesn't show you a commitment to your new frog, and I think that I mean, one of the things that stands out for me was it was a speech that when Tencent were going to launch their, or rather the parent company of Tencent, were going to launch their IPO. Jack Ma, the head of Tencent and the head of, I can't remember the parent company name.
Alibaba.
That's it.
Yeah.
He gave a speech to gathered bankers in Beijing. And following that speech, he disappeared for 3 months. Now, that speech was reported in the Western media as being his criticism of Xi Jinping's banking reforms. But a couple of Chinese journalists managed to get out a translation. Now, I'm relying on the translation of that. But reading that, he didn't really make any major criticisms of Xi Jinping's banking reforms. He criticized what he called the old money from the West. And at one point, he actually said, "Why do we need them?" At which point, this is one of obviously one of the most well-known billionaires in the world, just vanished. And it was reported, I'm sure he was being re-educated somewhere. It was reported in the West that was because he criticized Xi Jinping, but it wasn't. He was criticizing the Western banking elite, and then he vanished. So it seems clear to me that's, if we look at FDI, that the West has built up China. Now, less so, obviously, they took a different tack, as Catherine said, in Russia. They just tried to steal all its assets. There's no, they did that. I mean, the oligarchs were ripping it off through countries like, companies like Pimlico, which the central bank was involved in ripping it off. So it's but so that kind of shows you something as well about the structure of, for example, the position and I would suggest the sovereignty of central banks, because there's no doubt that the central bank of Russia was involved in ripping off the country.
Right.
So criminally involved in ripping off the country. Now, that has been replaced subsequently with what I would suggest is a new oligarchy who, as Catherine said, is much more closely aligned to the government. I mean, there's that famous meeting where in 2009, I think, when Putin allegedly said, this is the way it's going to be. You toe the line and, you'll still be able to do business. But there are still, through things like the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, we see the same kind of nexus between private capital and state capital. And I think what the difference is, perhaps, that we see in Russia is that there's the political side of that equation, if you like, has said we have political control. We set the political environment, we set the policy environment, but providing that everything goes along, we can do business, because there are a lot of big companies like USM and people like that in Russia, and a lot of new billionaires who, by the way, did really well out of the pseudo pandemic. They made their fortunes rose faster than anywhere. So there is this same kind of thing, which I would call the public-private partnership, that, and in one sense, I would suggest in Russia, that has reached its zenith. That is where the state and the corporations are as one. It is, there is no division between them because there is a political and corporate alignment. So, but it's as Patrick was saying earlier, it's the same game. So, having destroyed the Western economic model, the debt-based system, what's the debt to GDP ratio in the East compared to the West? Like 10%, 15, 20%. So that is ripe for expansion. So they built it up, they've jumped off their dead frog, and now they're jumping onto a new one.
Right, and I would say a lot of the debt in the West, because if you look at what happened in the United States, they bubbled the economy and sucked that money and reinvested it in China. So the debt that is now hanging in the West, the Westerners will be hung with it, the citizens will be hung with it, but the investment will be credited. That money went into the investment in China, and somebody else has their name on it, not the people who are liable for the debt.
Yeah.
I would say, the interesting point of difference to study is Russia, because into the late 90s, with the resignation of Boris Yeltsin, Russia was, I would say, almost deliberately humiliated. There was, I don't think, if you chart China, the rise of China has been pretty steady. And it's never been as violently opposed as the Soviet Union was, and as even newly capitalist Russia was. And I think that process was intended to continue. And the unaccounted for factor was President Vladimir Putin. I don't think they understood him as a person when he came into power. I thought they expected him to carry on doing what Yeltsin did. And there is I would say, a more genuine conflict with Putin's Russia up until relatively recently, where they decided to stop trying to crush Russia again and invite them to the same table they'd already invited China to. And I think that has basically created the Eurasian bloc that was originally going to be simply the rise of China. And Russia was meant to be, they still talk about splitting Russia into tiny republics and stuff as a sort of, that was a plan, I think a genuine one, but I don't think it is anymore.
No.
Well, if I can contribute something here, I've been doing a lot of research on this for my upcoming book. And it seems to me that a lot of what was going on with Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union was to install a very particular oligarchy with very particular links to, Russian organized crime and Israel and, allied elites in the West. And I think it is worth noting sort of people like Mark Rich, for example, and people that were sort of associated in some ways with him and Robert Maxwell and that whole network were really involved in the capital flight and the privatization of assets. And actually, his son Kevin Maxwell also involved to an extent in this as well. And if you look at, I don't want to give too much away because I have a book that's coming out, but there is a lot to be said about the different types of, the oligarchs, the Russian oligarchs that were sort of chosen more or less during this period and became, the people in control of the resources. And like Patrick was saying earlier about the Trilateral Commission, if you have the resources, that's the real power. And there's a lot of it's very interesting to look at their particular associations. And at the same time, with the rise of China, you have people, Israel, for example, playing a major role in technology transfer as it relates to China. For example, the CIA director in 1993 telling Congress that Israel had been doing this for over a decade, military technology that was had been given to them by the West, but was sort of supposed to be blocked by the West from being given to China. Israel was covertly doing this for a very long time, and it got a lot more extensive through the Clinton administration, which is the Clinton administration's involvement in that is truly mind-boggling for people that are familiar. But one of the early people that was involved, Israel's role in passing this technology to China began in 1979. Intimately involved there is one of the richest men in Israel named Saul Eisenberg, who had a very close relationship with Israeli intelligence and also a rather cozy relationship with Robert Maxwell. And if you look at Robert Maxwell's career, as I've had to do for this book, technology transfer to the former Soviet Union and also, through his successors to China, in a sense, is really mind-boggling to a significant degree. So that's all I really sort of wanted to add there, is that Israel has played a major role in that, but it's not necessarily overtly the government. It's some of these networks that tend to be transnational in scope and involving people that are sort of in this web of organized crime intelligence that I cover extensively in my upcoming book. But I don't want to, I'm supposed to be hosting this, so.
Can I ask a question? Mm-hmm. The BRICS have their 2022 summit right now, so as we're meeting, they're meeting. And they're talking about putting together a new reserve currency together. Now, they were working on that in 2019 before the G7 bankers voted the going direct reset. And the reset kind of threw that in the hopper while the world, did the COVID, whatever that was. So they're now back at the table looking at doing a 5 currency basket. And they're doing it after a period since the sanctions started where the Russian ruble is significantly outperforming the US dollar. And the US dollar index is up and performing very well, but the ruble is performing even better. So I'm very curious what the other members of the panel think about what's going to happen with that and where they think it's going to go. Do they think it will be successful? What does it mean?
Okay. Well, we can move to that. I was going to talk or ask first about Ukraine and then segue from sanctions to,
let's go to
that.
Yeah, let's go to Ukraine. Let's go to Ukraine.
Well, make sure to bring that up once we get there, if that's okay.
Yep.
Alrighty. So, turning to the situation in Ukraine, why did this war come about, and for what purpose? I'll start with Iain there, since you did a pretty in-depth series on it, though you don't have to give an in-depth answer if you don't wish to.
No, I haven't got a clue. That's the answer.
Okay.
I mean, clearly there are genuine military concerns for that Russia can say, yeah. Particularly the expansionism, NATO expansionism, and particularly I think they've overplayed, and I think Putin has very much and the Russian clique that he represents have very much overplayed the Nazi element in Ukraine, although they certainly have got the government at a disadvantage. And that's due to going back to something I think it was Kit mentioned earlier, going all the way back to the post-war period where, the CIA and MI6 were working with the Banderites to destabilize, the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. So, it was, so that has definitely been a concern for Russia. If you've got, a political, and obviously there was the 2014 coup, which was a coup. I mean, it was a CIA-backed coup. I mean, there's no two ways about that. So, and then you've got the DPR and the LPR, you've got a long war that's been going on there. So what I'm trying to say is that from a Russian perspective, if you were looking at it from a cold-hearted military and defense and security analysis point of view, you can see that Russia's point. However, it is set within this massive thing that we are talking about now, this global transition of power. Now, that global transition of power has been talked about at length for decades. You could go back all the way back to the 1970s to see people talking about it. We can, even looking at things like George Soros gave that interview to the Financial Times saying China will be the engine of the world, the economic engine of the world. I mean, now we're seeing things like, recently Russia has overtaken Saudi Arabia as China's main oil supplier. Prior to it, we saw Russia and China, Putin and Xi Jinping's joint statement about how there would be no limit to their cooperation. So although this is why I'm saying I don't know, because although there are genuine military reasons why you might say, yeah, I can understand why Russia had to act, it just fits so perfectly with the plans that have been long laid, and also the fact that, the sanctions themselves are delivering everything that the quote unquote, the Great Reset is all about. So it's difficult. I haven't put my finger on it yet, is the answer. But I mean, I think that it's a complex issue.
Yeah, well, it definitely is complex. That's for sure.
I would actually go a little bit further than that and say, I'm not sure there are military reasons to justify it. There are political statements that claim to justify it, but strategically, it doesn't actually make any sense. If you're worried about NATO expansionism, this is almost literally the worst thing they could possibly have done. They've already driven Finland and maybe Sweden into reconsidering joining NATO. And these are places that just need an excuse. Even if they're successful in getting all the way to Kiev and cutting Ukraine in half and keeping the bit with the Russians in, which is apparently what their plan is, Ukraine still exists. It's just smaller and will definitely join NATO because you just got rid of all the people who didn't want to. All the people that wanted to keep Ukraine out of NATO will now be in Russia, and Ukraine will just be a smaller country that will definitely join NATO. So I'm not sure strategically it makes any sense. I mean, the humanitarian war claim to protect people of Donbass also doesn't really make much sense, because if they were going to do that, they could have done it 8 years ago. Mm-hmm. So I think the question mark here really is what changed to the Russian way of thinking about this and why? Because it was not at all beneficial to them to invade Ukraine for a long time.
If you look at the results, what you've done is you've dramatically shifted energy to the east, right? And you have dramatically weakened Europe and the euro, which is the number one competitor to the dollar for reserve currency status. That's what you've achieved. And you've put the G8 now, or the BRICS, in a position where they can do a new serious reserve currency. And you've bestowed, through the sanctions, enormous assets. Corporate assets have just been basically taken by the Russians thanks to your actions. So I would say, if you look at what the West is doing with the sanctions and with this situation, they are significantly increasing the power and wealth of the East.
Yes, I think you're onto something.
They have the perfect excuse. They've tried every which way to jam their populations. They've tried health crisis, they've tried climate change, but this is now working.
Yeah.
I would agree, but I'm not sure how much that could be relied upon to be the result of. They can't know exactly what sanctions the EU and the US will put on them or how. And talking about the sanctions is interesting because the sanctions have had an almost suicidal effect, especially on Europe. Europe has fared worse from their own sanctions than Russia has in some ways, and I don't think they could have predicted that from the outset.
Yeah.
Oh, I do. I think if you look at the G7 leadership, I mean, the people who are really running the capital allocation, I think there's no way Russia could be doing what they're doing successfully without support from the West.
Yeah.
It's not possible. So, but I do think the people who allocate capital globally knew that this would advantage manufacturing and production in the East and disadvantage and permit the radical lowering of the economic footprint of the population in the G7. They could not know that.
Yeah, I feel like we're talking past each other slightly. I'm saying that Russia wouldn't possibly have launched that particular operation without a certain amount of foreknowledge of cooperation with regards to how the economic situation will play out.
Yeah.
Right.
I think. Sorry, Patrick, you go.
Oh, well, I was just going to say that I look at this like how the circus people spin plates on a stick. And, they try and get, one on their nose, one on their hand, and whatever, shoulder, and, wait. And everybody's amazed because eventually one plate goes flying off. If you look at the plates that are spinning right now, because of the war, you have an energy crisis all of a sudden. This is huge globally. It is not just in there, it's globally. You have a financial crisis that's directly related, I think, to the disruption of energy and what's going on with Putin demanding rubles, et cetera. It's throwing the entire monetary system up in the air. Then you have the agricultural crisis, which is global. It's not local, even though Ukraine is going to have probably one of the worst harvests it's had in decades. It's not going to be able to feed Europe like it used to. But all three of these plates that are spinning right now are near and dear to the technocracy's heart, near and dear. Mm. And you look at Russia now, how the power has shifted. Russia's the largest exporter of wheat in the world. They've got the food. Russia has the energy, too. And right now it has the balance of power tipping towards it as far as the ruble's concerned, even though I think we all probably agree that the paper currencies of the world are all going to go up at the same time when they finally blow. They're all going to burn. Not just this one or that one being higher or lower or whatever. They're all going to burn in the end. And they're going to have to do something digital. That's what the Great Reset predicts anyway, after the Great Reset is reset. Mm. But you look at all the plates spinning right now, and I'm still kind of, scratching my head over how this is all going to settle. And is one of these plates going to fall off and crack on the ground? Or are they going to try and spin some more plates at the same time? But right now, those three issues are huge on a global basis. They're affecting the entire planet. And you scratch your head and wonder, okay, how can a little thing in Ukraine make all this big ripple across the whole planet? And does this fit into the plans on the Great Reset? And what could be the motive? What could be behind this strategy to take down the world economic system? Because right now it seems to be working. And you think back to the enormity of the whole thing. I remember, well, I wasn't there, but I remember historically that the Ukraine is where the Holodomor took place, at the hands of Russia. Mm-hmm. They went and they stole the means of production from the farmers, and the farmers, millions and millions of them, starved to death in 1 year because they took away the means of production, the harvesters, the planters, the tractors, the fuel, the seed. They stole it all. And the whole swath of society just died on the spot. You say, wow, these people are ruthless, whoever they are. They can be ruthless. And you say, well, is something ruthless going on right now? And is Ukraine really just a prop for all these other things taking place right now? And I can't fully answer that question. But I do know, of course, that the U.S. was horribly involved in Ukraine for a number of years, a seedbed of corruption, as far as I'm concerned. If Hunter Biden wants to play there all the time, there's something wrong going on. It's just, he's the scum of business dealings. And so, you see all these other people that have had an interest from America that are meddling with what's going on over there. And you say the story may never fully come out, but something's really rotten in Denmark, and it isn't in Denmark, it's in Ukraine.
I mean, there is cooperation going on now. There is cooperation, in my view. I mean, if you look at, the fact that there's still oil trade going on, the Gazprom sleight of hand by enabling, well, the Hungarian Prime Minister says at least 10 countries to carry on with the gas trade in Europe. And then there's the point that the EU have stated that they are going to transition to this new, right? So this is a global thing anyway, but the EU are saying that, due to what's happening, we need to step up our efforts to transition to new energy sources. That now they're talking about using coal in the meantime, but where are they going to get the coal from? Probably Russia. Now, but the point is, in order to make that transition, they need to keep enough energy at the moment to be able to make that transition. They need to make a big infrastructure. If they're going to say use LNG, you need to have a massive infrastructure investment program and construction program. Well, that's going to take years. So who's going to supply them the energy in the meantime? They haven't got the terminal capacity and they haven't got the storage capacity to just switch to American LNG. So this is going to take many, many years. In the meantime, Russia, who economically speaking have now got new markets opening up with China and India and, well, the BRICS basically, they've got these new markets opening up. They no longer need the European market to the extent that they once did. So in order for the EU to make this transition to this new system, this potentially LNG-based system from American production, Russia's got to help them. Russia has got to maintain their energy for that period, or it doesn't, in which case then we are talking about a humanitarian tragedy of immense proportions in Europe.
Well, I think it's interesting, too, that a lot of the places in the West that have been greatly impacted by this have been the countries that have had in larger resistance, I guess you could say, to the designs of their government as it relates to the Great Reset. So what better way to get those portions of the populace under control than to have them desperate, hungry, cold, in the upcoming winter. I think if they, blame it all on a convenient boogeyman, they'll have a much more compliant population that won't be asking questions like, is this good for us or anything like that? They'll just want to have food in their bellies and things like that. At least I think maybe the central, the elite, the central planners, whatever, that are sort of looking at all of this may see opportunities, at least in certain parts of the West, for a squeeze of that nature to sort of force compliance as they introduce, socioeconomic changes that are massive in scope and would normally, under normal circumstances with full bellies and heated homes, they may not happen.
Mm.
And okay,
Yeah.
so
We did one.
I was just adding that as a possibility, but we can so I think we already sort of went over the next question, which is about the main impacts of the war and its effects on the West versus Eurasia. I think it's pretty clear to most people at this point that it's obviously been a much bigger boon.
I would like to add just one last thing to that. It's
Sure.
just interesting from a geopolitical perspective that the impact of the pandemic's lockdowns, which were meant to control the pandemic, was to have a hugely detrimental impact on the economies, mainly of Western Europe and America. And then the impact of the war was to do almost exactly the same thing. I just think you have to have an awful lot of faith in coincidence to simply dismiss that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You remember when when Klaus Schwab said that the pandemic represents a rare but narrow window of opportunity to reflect, reimagine, and reset our world. A bold statement. He has an overactive imagination, I'm sure. But that was, I don't know, that was a couple of years ago, I think, when he really said that. And I did a presentation in which I made up a slide on ways to destroy capitalism, because I figured that's what the goal is here, is to destroy capitalism. So I just kind of brainstormed with myself. And I thought, if you want to destroy capitalism from his point of view, what would you do? And here are the I wrote down 9 things just off the top of my head. Number 1 was withdraw energy. Number 2 is withdraw resources. Number 3 is corrupt the supply chain. Number 4 is withdraw labor. Number 5 is withdraw financing and capital, which has certainly been done. Next is limit consumption, like through inflation now, whatever. Limit innovation, that is, new ideas and stuff. Create cataclysmic event. Yeah, well, maybe, I don't know, maybe that's Ukraine. And then the last one, which is really important, is create malinvestment or disinvestment. And I know, Catherine, I know you can address this, but anytime money is diverted into places where it doesn't belong, all hell breaks loose. That's what's happened in the past. And that's what's happening right now.
And what's very interesting, one of the things we're seeing is malinvestment as a way to take the people who would normally protect society and get them off on a tangent and engaged. So you pump and dump this, you pump and dump that, and you literally drag them off into a rabbit hole. And it's been a brilliant marketing plan. They've been able to pump and dump some of the most potentially difficult people who could really stop them from doing what they're doing. And so they've done a masterful job of controlling the opposition and with financial incentives. And it's huge. I've never seen malinvestment like this before.
Yeah, I haven't either. I agree. Totally.
There's, in addition to the currency question, there's another question I'm dying to ask Whitney. Can I do that?
Yeah, of course.
I don't want to interrupt your flow.
No,
so everyone here has a really powerful role in what I would describe as new media. And one of the things I've thought a lot about is the fact that the populations in the G7 country have grown up in a world where the narratives are oversimplistic, and increasingly fake. So they have all these false frameworks and these false maps, and it's kind of a dumbed down official narrative. If you leave that world and you go to China, you go to Russia, you enter into a world that is much more dealing with complexity. And the way Dr. Farrell used to always talk about it, he said in America, the music has the drum beat, it's got 1 track. In Europe, you're listening to Vivaldi, it has 24 tracks. But the G7 populations have been in this oversimplistic narrative and really aren't prepared to deal with the complexity of the real world. And yet each one of you has a significant role in the media helping them make that migration. So I'm curious what you think about how the G7 populations are going to leave, the Minnie and Mickey behind and go into the real world.
There's a lot of different ways that can play out, and I don't think it's going to be the same for everyone, because I think there's different segments of the population of each country that are going to react differently. For example, years ago, I tried to talk about other people my age, about stuff that I write about now. And a lot of people just were like, I hear what you're saying, I hear the facts. But I don't want to readjust my worldview because it's too scary to think that things are on that level in terms of like corruption and, an elite agenda and all of this stuff. So I think there's going to be people that are going to have to reckon with that. Because people don't like being lied to either. So there may be people that are too scared to recognize that there's people who may be too, arrogant or full of pride to admit they've been duped for X number of years. And then there's people that are like, I don't want to live in this world that's being foisted upon us, and are going to respond accordingly. But I think it's kind of unpredictable how many people are going to fall into each camp of that. And I can't really say this percent and that percent. I can't really quantify that, but I think there's going to be different responses. But I think when people are confronted with those facts and having to look at the situation as it is, the less alone they feel, and having in terms of knowing people that have a different worldview than what they've been told their whole lives helps. People that feel like they're the only one. I sort of felt like that when I sort of looked into all this stuff when I was in college and university, and I was like, I am literally the only one that thinks this. That's how I felt. And it was it can be really lonely and scary for some people. I already was weird at the university I went to, so it was fine. But for some people it's not. I think the less alone people can feel, the more supportive people can be when they're talking to people about this stuff. Yeah, talking about people who consume the media we and others generate. I think that's helpful in helping people, make those steps. Because otherwise, if they feel really isolated and fear can take over, I guess. And it's less likely to if they feel there's a lot of other people that feel the same way, maybe. I don't know if anyone else agrees with that or not.
That's very true. I mean, one of the most common comments we get on all of our articles and have done since the beginning of COVID is, I'm so glad I read this. I felt like I was the only person that thought this way. It's very powerful for people to not feel like they're in a minority of one.
I think
I would also say, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
In terms of what people will do in the Western world, I think we've already seen a glimpse of that. I think there's been certainly a rise in the UK, which is not at all doesn't have any kind of libertarian history like America does. There's been a rise of individualist thinking, a rise of simply disengaging. I will grow my own food and run my own business. I will bank as little as possible. These are things that people I knew didn't talk about a few years ago. But that rise is coming to the point where you can sort of say, well, people will sense the game is rigged and simply decide not to play, I hope.
Right.
And one thing that the other editor of Guardian, Kat, always says is that people generally will believe what they're told until it becomes much easier not to. And people might play along, but eventually when they're cold and hungry, playing along will lose its appeal and will become easier to rebel than it is to keep on going.
Yeah, I think it's unmistakable right now that there is a movement worldwide. It's spontaneous. It's not organized by anybody, but I see the movement towards people kind of trying to create a parallel economic system. That's what you're describing, get together in a food co-op or have some other thing that you're doing locally with people in your community. I think we're going to see more and more of that come. It's a necessity. It's not even a philosophical position. You want to live, you want to get along, you get together with your friends and neighbors and stuff, and you work stuff out. I think we're going to see more of that. When I was researching and studying the first implications of Agenda 21 and the Biodiversity Convention, just looking at the implications if they actually did what they said they were going to do to curtail all the things, economic activity, like getting rid of cars and going back to walking communities, that sort of thing. Where would that take us economically? Well, what we came up with, and I don't know if it's true today, but what I came up with back then was it would put us back somewhere around 1850 in terms of economic convenience. That was not really a good time in the world. I mean, people survived, they lived, they had lives, and a lot of them died younger than they die today, but people did get along. But nobody today would really think that would be a good lifestyle to go back to. And yet, the people that are creating the economic communities now, the kind of parallel, let's get out of that system and quit listening to the man, and we'll go over here and do our own thing. That's kind of the structure they're moving into, is kind of back, what people did back in 1850, like water purifiers and, worrying about ways to just grow enough food to survive, don't worry about steaks on the table. Just worry about enough carrots in the ground to be able to pull and get some nourishment. How are you going to get clothes? How are you going to make clothes? Do Do you stock up on fabric and get a sewing machine and be prepared to make your own food? Well, that's what they did back in 1850. We're kind of headed towards that era again for those people who realize they need to pull out and go do something different. And they will be the outliers, but for sure. But it is a very difficult time ahead of us. Very difficult time. If people want to survive, they're going to have to take up that mentality to some extent, and they're going to have to be willing to sacrifice a lot of conveniences in life that they've known for all these years, for all their life. They're going to have to figure, well, we're just going to have to go back to another era and live and worry about survival, worry about living, worry about raising our family, taking care of our loved ones, stuff like that, defending ourselves, right? There's the other aspect of that too that will drive more people to it, and that's war. I think war is going to become a normal thing on planet Earth, more likely than not. And the old saying, where goods don't flow, soldiers will, is still true today. I think that's part of what we see in Ukraine right now. When goods don't flow, all hell's going to break loose. And this is kind of going on all over the planet right now. Stuff isn't flowing. So likely, people are going to get very angry before this is done. Why isn't there seed in that ground over there? That farm has been operating for 50 years. Why aren't there crops growing in that? People can get really ticked off. I can see a lot of conflict coming. So, again, back to the old Wild West, every family had to defend itself against robbers and, marauders or whatever forces were out there trying to do them in.
So, Patrick, it looks to me like there's a real effort to get the U.S. to break up and get states to secede. Do you see that? You're in the United States.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I've been in touch, actually, a pretty good friend, a guy who's working on New California, which is a breakaway. Hopefully, they think it's going to be a breakaway from California. And they've got many counties signed up now to go with the program.
Right.
And there's other states that are pursuing the same thing, not only breaking away from the state under our federal government, but just totally seceding altogether from the U.S. It's just an elemental stage right now, but you can see that there's a lot of sentiment that says, hey, we're so sick and tired of this, we just don't want anything to do with it anymore.
Well, but back to global investment capital. If you're global investment capital and you want to get out of the liabilities and the retirement obligations, you can have the state secede and blame it on the people. And you're out of the liabilities.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. I think one of the biggest risks in America today, I don't know why I'm bringing this up, but one of the biggest risks in America today is the government. The government now, federal government with no constitutional authority to do so, owns something like 350 million acres of land in America. I mean, it's just huge. It's like 28% of our land mass is owned by the federal government.
Yep.
The big risk at this point is, I think,
they auction it off.
What will they do in the end? Will they auction it off? Will they sell it? Will they trade it for some sort of a digital currency plan for backing? I mean, I have no idea what to do with it, but I don't like the fact that that the federal government owns that much of our property out here where we live. And the West is more so than
they take they take the position under the financial arrangements that in fact they own everything if they have to pay the debt.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, to go back to what happened with Argentina in 2001 after their economy collapsed, there was a major effort to get them to trade land, most of southern Argentina actually, in exchange for a forgiveness of their debt, a debt for land swap, they were calling it. So that's definitely like not unprecedented. And you could easily argue that 2001 economic collapse was really engineered by the people that were put in as the economists and stuff in the early 90s. And throughout Argentina in that whole decade that preceded it, it was kind of like an engineered collapse, right? And if you look at this as an engineered demolition of the U.S. economy or the Western economy in general, it's definitely a very definite possibility that something like that could happen. Who would it go to? I guess that's a big question.
I'm looking at to assert. I don't know, Patrick, if you got our latest taxation wrap up. I think I sent it to both you and Whitney. But I'm looking to assert a common law right of offset of $21 trillion against the central banks.
Yeah.
Think of it as a land protection.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
Well, they've
Well, you
stolen.
know-
I mean, they were depository. They're legally liable. They've stolen $21 trillion that we can prove and document.
Yeah. I
So,
know.
so
Incredible.
so the bankers can't necessarily grab all the land.
No, they can't. But you know, the debt for land swaps were done. The land ended up in the control of the United Nations, mostly through the
Right.
World Bank and through the BIS. The land, the control of the land, the management of the land, we'll put it that way, ended up in the hands of the United Nations, and they passed it out to some NGOs and stuff in some cases to manage the land. But the countries where the land existed didn't get the right to do anything on it. They lost all their development rights, all their mining, mineral, everything else rights for the land. And often the land that was taken was the best land they had to offer. No wonder they were mad at us for so many years. You know, we just absolutely. Well, I say we. These banksters and the global banksters and stuff absolutely raped these countries, just pillaged and plundered. And it's no wonder they got mad. But now we're in the same position because if 28% of our country all of a sudden goes to the United Nations, and you say, well, okay, if resource grabbing was the plan in the first place, gee, how'd that work out? They just grabbed a third of our country, and now it's not ours anymore, and they're going to use it for whatever. But part of the sequestering of resources is just somebody, you mentioned Spectre along the way. I'm an old James Bond fan, of course. You remember Goldfinger?
Right.
Goldfinger, everybody thought in the plot he's going to rob Fort Knox and take all the gold. That would have been a great plan, right? But you'd have to have a lot of trucks to get the gold out. You learn then, no, that's not the idea. He bought up all the free market gold that was out there he could get his hands on. And he was going to blow up an atomic device inside of Fort Knox, so irradiate the gold so that nobody would touch it for the next 500 years. That would make him filthy, stinking rich, and he'd control the world. Well, this is exactly what's going on when the United Nations takes millions and millions of acres of prime resource acres and takes them offline where nobody could touch them. All of a sudden, the remaining resources that are out there go through the roof.
Right.
I think what you're talking about. Sorry.
Yeah, well, they don't have to control the whole thing. That's all I'm saying. When they take something out of production, the stuff that remains in their control all of a sudden is worth everything, and that's where people are getting their resources from. Probably
right. So if you own the synthetic food companies and you take down the agriculture and the ranching.
Yeah, I was about to say that under the guise of climate change, it's very likely that a lot of land, not just in the U.S., but really in any number of countries, is going to be taken out of agricultural use because of concerns about carbon footprints.
They're already doing that in the U.S. They're having the conservation fund paying farmers not to farm and let their land go wild again.
Exactly.
Apparently for the environment.
Exactly.
So I am proud to announce that the EU has accepted both yachts and corporate jets from all of these requirements.
Yeah, funny how that works, huh?
Let's all band together and buy a private jet. What do you say?
There you go.
All right. Any other thoughts before we conclude about the East-West dichotomy? The last question I had, I don't know if you all want to have like any concluding thoughts related to it, but the last question I had was whether the East-West dichotomy is we must pick a side, whether it's entirely false or somewhere in the middle. Maybe we could briefly discuss that before closing out.
I would say, this is just a point of principle, I don't pick a side, like left or right, east or west. I don't see any benefit in pledging allegiance to anything like without some kind of reservation of judgment. I just think that's sound policy.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think it's fair to say that over the course of this discussion, we've described that dichotomy as existing at some levels, but overall it's mostly transnational in scope, right? So it's hard to make a dichotomy out of something that's ultimately driven by transnational interests that don't, exist, just, extend to the east and to the west, not just one or the other. Fair enough?
Yeah.
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 Okay.
I would say that, we basically, if you ask the average human being anywhere on this planet, if they want to invade another country, they want to steal another country's resources, they want to harm their neighbour, the vast majority, absent the kind of influence that are put on them by, other people. But most people just want to live a good life. They want to raise their families. They just want to be, and most people, I think, are decent. So if we're going to take a side, I think we should just take the side of each other. And we should just put aside the fact that there are massive global corporations and financial institutions and political, institutions that want to divide us. So the answer to respond to that is that we shouldn't be divided, and we shouldn't go around blaming other people for our problems. We have to take responsibility for them.
Yeah, perfect. That's exactly right. We need to reconnect again, and COVID drove people apart, drove families apart, society apart and stuff. If there was ever a time that we needed to get back in touch with each other and literally face to face, touching, hugging, whatever, dealing with real people. If there's any encouragement to this, I remember when the lights went out in New York City. I wasn't there, but I remember reading about it. It was years ago, and everything went down in New York City. And people outside of New York City says, "Oh my gosh, it's going to be the end of New York City. There's going to be anarchy, chaos, killing. It's just going to be a dystopian movie like Blade Runner or something." But the interesting thing that happened, the lights went out, but all of a sudden at night there was no air conditioning, nothing. People came out in the streets. They had no other place to go. They just hot in their apartment. They walked out in the streets and they said, "Gee, there's other people here." And all of a sudden they started hugging each other. They started talking with each other and helping each other and taking care of each other. And there was one of the biggest love fest America's ever seen. And then unfortunately the lights came back on and they all went back to where they started. But it emphasizes what you're talking about. This part, possibly one of the best things that could happen in some cities would be if the lights go out, people go out in the street and say, "Gee, I have neighbors. Who's that guy down the street? I've never met him. What's he all about?" We need to get back in touch with each other again. In small groups, maybe large groups, but at least in small groups and stuff. And that is so important, especially in America. That's one reason I'm really just pushing free Citizens for Free Speech in America right now as a nonprofit organization, trying to do just that, to get people connected again. And you remember the Ron Paul revolution? I know you remember, Catherine. You guys from Great Britain probably won't, but the Ron Paul revolution years ago when he ran for president was fueled and almost successful by the concept of meetups. And meetups were held all over the country spontaneously. Young people said, "Hey, let's meet in the park." 25, 30 people would show up. Sometimes 100 would show up. "Hey, bring a picnic or something, come to the park. We're just going to talk about stuff." And people would just spontaneously show up all over the country. And they were laughing and they were drinking and they were hugging and, they're having changing stories. And it was a lightning rod for his campaign. And the concept of meetups would have the same effect today if people started getting together again. Even if it's just informally, it could transform a lot of what's taking place today. You just cannot ignore people. When real people meet other real people, that's when the activism really takes root and really starts to be meaningful in a local community. And then it percolates up from there.
Yeah.
So I would just add, I agree with everything that's been said, but what I see, and I see it happening in every country, is a division between those who want to embrace a future which I would describe as inhuman and those who want to embrace a human culture.
Yes.
And
exactly.
the divide, you can't describe the divide as right or left or this country versus that country. It comes down to what's in the hearts of each human. And what we have to do is we have to support and nurture the people who want a human future, and we have to withdraw our support and shun the people who want an inhuman future.
Yes.
And unfortunately, a small group of people who are dedicated to an inhuman future have gotten way too much control of the global financial system, and we're going to have to grapple with that. But ultimately, I've always believed they're going to lose because they are so out of alignment with the fundamental laws of science, nature, and even economics. So
Mhm.
I just think we have to, in every way possible, embrace the human. And I have to say, it's always fun to get together with a group of people who do that all the time and get to meet some of you or get to talk to some of you. So I've really enjoyed this.
Well, that's a really great point, Catherine, because I think, well, I haven't been as involved with the stuff I normally do because I have a huge book project, but I have seen just a huge uptick in news stories that are like insanely promoting the inhuman, promoting
Right.
you will have virtual children, Tamagotchi children, no more actual children for you.
Can I take my favorite yesterday? I don't know.
Sure.
The British among us probably saw this, but they had a long list of all the adverse events from the injections and attributed them to masturbation. It was in the Daily Mail. I don't know if you guys saw it. It was hysterical. It was the funniest thing I ever seen.
They've had a list of them that are pretty funny, like making your bed too strenuously, sitting up too quickly. There's like I forget who, someone's been compiling a list of.
Now it's
of all
just,
of them.
of course, now it's just spontaneous adult death syndrome.
Yeah.
You just drop it.
There was a great book written a few years ago by Wesley C. Smith of Discovery Institute. It was called The War on Humans.
Right.
And it was very good, I thought, at the time, because it very succinctly described the war on humans and consequently humanity and civilization. But this war, this is what we're kind of discussing here. There is a war going on, and it's not just in a general war like in the Ukraine or whatever. It's a war against humanity, against humans, human nature, human virtue, human dignity. And this is where the real rebellion and resistance needs to take place. I think that's what we just said.
Right.
All right. So I guess with that, we'll close out. So thank you all for being here and participating. Can you let everyone know? I mentioned your websites at the beginning, but let everyone know where they can find you online. So we'll start with Catherine and just go.
Solari.com. The Solari is Solari.com.
Kit, where can people
you
find
can
you?
find Off Guardian, like you said, off-guardian.org, and on Twitter at offguardian0, and I personally on Twitter at kit_nightly. And we have a Telegram channel, which is where you're most likely to get updates. And I never ever remember what the @@ is, but I will send the links.
You can
to the
just
show
search
notes.
for Off Guardian on Telegram and it'll come up
we'll turn
as a
up.
channel. Yeah. All right, Patrick?
Yeah, technocracy.news for me, and possibly citizensforfreespeech.org. We're trying to promote free speech in America, and we learned that's a universal concept, though. Free speech is something in the heart of man everywhere in every country on the planet.
Okay, Iain?
It's inthistogether.com. It's -this-together.com. But hopefully I'm moving over to a new domain soon because nobody can remember that one. So I'm moving.
Yeah, too many hyphens.
Too many hyphens.
You went Off Guardian with your hyphens.
Yeah, I don't know what that was about.
It's a long story.
All right. And as for me, you can find my stuff on Unlimited Hangout, also on Twitter and Telegram for now. But a lot of this that we've been talking about, centralized power, a lot of the stuff, the censorship's really bad. And in keeping with what we were saying at the end, I think a lot of the ability to distribute what Catherine earlier called new media is going to end up being local. So, for people watching this, maybe consider in your local community thinking about a non-big tech dependent way to distribute news that you think is important to people understanding what's going on in your local community, so that if, big tech decides to, flip the switch, because, Telegram is an alternative, but it's not necessarily safe.
Yeah.
None of these platforms really are. So we need to try and think about that as well.
Order your book.
Oh, my book? Oh, well, now that you ask, no, sorry. But you can order it directly from the publisher, which is Trine Day, TRINE, day, you'll get the book more quickly if you order it from them. But it's also available on Amazon and other places where books are sold via pre-order. But there was a delay because of the supply chain. It's not my fault this time. For people that know, it was delayed previously because I had I ended up having a high-risk pregnancy and couldn't work on it. Because as you will see, it's a very detailed, voluminous book. And my regular online work, imagine that in book form. That's basically what it is. So it was hard to do. So, but this time it's not my fault. It's their fault now. But, it's all right. It'll be there soon.
I know we can pre-order it now, but when is it expected to be released? Do you know?
Okay, so now because of the supply chain stuff, it's supposed to be September, like mid-ish September. But review copies to people will be going out before, and I'll be doing interviews about it before then. Yeah, but that'll be that. So you can look for that as well. It's about a lot more than just Jeffrey Epstein. He's sort of my vehicle for exploring a large web of corruption in the U.S. and abroad. How exciting! Anyway,
I hate to be a stickler for details, but you never actually said what the book was called.
Oh, One Nation Under Blackmail is the title. So
Nice,
excellent title.
Thanks. All right. So thanks everyone, and thanks everyone for watching. And please share this video as widely as you'd like to help us overcome the aforementioned tech censorship. And thanks again to all our panelists for participating.
Thank you, Whitney.
Thank you, Whitney. Great job. Thank you for pulling it together.